Thanks, Helen, and hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this training session on behalf of Equality Rights Alliance, the National Women's Safety Alliance, and Women with Disabilities Australia. My name is Sophie, and I'm currently the acting CEO of Women with Disabilities Australia. I'm a person with disability, and my pronouns are she, her. To provide a visual description, I am a young woman with brown hair and brown eyes and white skin. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we are all on today. I'm speaking from Wurundjeri land in the Kulin Nation, and I want to pay my respects to elders past and present. I acknowledge that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I would also like to acknowledge the unique experiences, identities, interests, and abilities of everyone here today. Each individual here today brings a valuable perspective, so thank you for joining us. I encourage you to engage in this session in the way that feels right for you. You might prefer to have your camera off, to move around while you listen, to take breaks, or like me, to use a fidget tool to help you pay attention. We have live captioners, Auslan interpreters, and counselling support available. There are also instructions in the participation guide that you've received for using Zoom's accessibility features. Please let us know if you need any help to see the captions or interpreters. If you are speaking, please keep in mind that the interpreters and captioners are working hard to catch everything that you say. Please speak slowly so that we can all follow the conversation. If you need any support for your well-being during this session, you can speak to a counsellor in a separate Zoom session. We'll provide the link to the separate Zoom session so that you can access it at any time, and I understand that it's been provided by email already. I'd like to thank Ange Cook, who is joining us to provide well-being support today, as well as the captioners and interpreters for their support. This session will teach you about the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, otherwise known as CEDAW. Helen from the Equality Rights Alliance will give a talk about CEDAW and will introduce us to the list of issues which the CEDAW Committee wants the Australian government to address. You will be able to ask questions using the chat, or by asking a question verbally, or by adding your question to an online whiteboard. We've provided a link to the whiteboard by email. If you'd like to ask a question verbally, please use the raise hand function. There are some instructions on how to do this in your participant guide, but you can let us know if you need any help. In this session, you'll also be told how to prepare for our consultation workshops, where we'll ask you for your thoughts and your ideas. After the training session today, you'll also be sent a link to an online survey, which will then be another opportunity to share your thoughts and ideas. I think that is all from me for now. So once again, welcome and thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks very much, Sophie. And I too would like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the lands of the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people down here in Canberra, where it's a beautiful blue sky day. I would like to acknowledge their elders past and present, and I would like to acknowledge that not only are these lands unceded, but that this is unfinished business that we need to pay some real attention to in this country. So thank you everybody for joining us today. I am Helen Daly-Fisher. I'm the convener of the Equality Rights Alliance, and I am here today to give you a brief overview of the way you can get involved in the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, which we call CEDAW. CEDAW is a treaty that's part of a much bigger set of, I'm going to pause already, a much bigger set of instruments and structures and a whole range of commitments from states and NGOs and all sorts of people being involved in this wonderful sort of network that we call human rights. I'm going to pop some slides up now, just so that you can have a bit of a follow along. I will just say we don't have a chat here because we are working with a webinar today. So if you want to ask a question, please do so using the Q&A function. And when you do that, if you prefer to speak rather than to type your entire question out, do feel free to use the Q&A function to be able to say, I would like to speak. I can then give you permission because I have apparently godlike powers in a webinar environment. So let's start, and I'll just check with my offsider. We can see the slides? Mm-hmm. Excellent. All right. Let's start by having a look at that broader context in which human rights takes place and in which we find CEDAW. The UN is an incredibly complicated entity, as you would expect when you're trying to bring the entire world together. There isn't much point in us trying to go deeply into how human rights structures operate within the broader context of the UN. But the important thing to know is that all of the human rights treaties and decisions and general resolutions and so on that we normally deal with come out of a body called the General Assembly. And the General Assembly is a body which is the meeting place for all the states who are members of the UN to come together and to negotiate agreed positions. One of the agreed positions that they negotiate is the text of treaties or conventions. And throughout this presentation, I'll use the term treaty or convention interchangeably. They actually mean the same thing. So the General Assembly commissions the drafting of treaties or conventions on human rights, and then adopts those treaties. And then they set up treaty bodies. And you can see in this diagram that I'm looking at now, we have a diagram which says that at the top we have the General Assembly, and then the General Assembly does two things. It either adopts or creates. And when it adopts the human rights treaties. And then it sets up treaty bodies, the committees. And when it's doing its creates function, it's created the Human Rights Council. And that council is responsible for a range of special procedures. So the Human Rights Council has a whole range of meetings and resolutions that it passes. And it also conducts something called the Universal Periodic Review of Human Rights. That's a different process to the CEDAW process that we're going to be talking about today. And in the next year or so, we will probably start to do some training around what you can do to get involved in the Universal Periodic Review of Human Rights. But for our purposes today, we're interested in the human rights treaties and conventions. And so I've moved to another slide, which starts to explain the structure of the human rights treaties and instruments that we're working with. So the big sort of grandparent document for all of the human rights treaties and conventions is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is 75 years old this year. And I think it's worth noting that in this year when UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, turned 75, my mum turned 77. Which tells you how recent all of the progress we've made on human rights internationally is. It's all happened within my mum's lifetime. And so I think it's worth keeping that in mind when you engage in international processes, that everything that we're going to talk about today has been done within a lifetime. And so it's a huge amount of work. And sometimes working in the international space can feel a little bit like we're moving very slowly, like we're pushing a stone up a hill. That is because we're doing an awful lot very quickly. It just doesn't necessarily feel like it. So keep that in mind as you go through the CEDAW process. After the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was first implemented, we got two more conventions very quickly, and they are the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. You might hear me call them ICCPR or ISCA. And the first, ICCPR, is about the relationship between individual people and the state, and what sort of limits there are on states' powers and what states need to do to meet the human rights of individuals. ISCA, the International Convention on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, is much more about the way we live our everyday lives. So it's about how we relate to each other. It's about the things that we need in order to live decent lives. And when we look at ISCA, the focus is not on on what we need to do for each other. The focus is on what the state needs to do to make sure that our basic needs are met. Then there are two other classes of treaties. One is a class of treaties that relate to particular issues. So the specific phenomena treaties. And these are the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, the Convention Against Torture and Other Inhuman, Degrading Treatment or Punishment, Convention on Enforced Disappearances. They're three examples of those sorts of treaties, and they're about a specific problem. Then there's another group of treaties, which is about specific groups of people. And this is where we get to the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW. So CEDAW is a treaty which tells us how to implement the rights that are in the UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in the ICCPR, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and in the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, or ISCA. So a couple of examples of those treaties that address specific issues. They include things like the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, which some people call ICERD. That convention is drafted around the idea of a problem, whereas there are other conventions that deal with racism, but which are directed at specific populations. For example, this isn't actually a treaty, but the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples addresses racial discrimination, but it's one of those ones that's aimed at individual people. Other sorts of instruments in this area are things like the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman or Degrading Treatment or Punishment, or the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance, which is a recent example. Here's a couple of examples of the treaties that protect specific groups. CEDAW obviously is there, and it's worth noting that there's an optional protocol to CEDAW, which we will talk about later. It's an extra bit, an add-on. But other similar ones are CRC, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the International Convention for the Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers and their Families, and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So let's look specifically at CEDAW itself. And I should say, do feel free to ask questions at any time. So make sure that you can use the Q&A function, which is on your toolbar. Feel free to pop either your question in there or feel free to ask to be taken off mute. And we have people watching that Q&A who can interrupt me. So moving into the CEDAW Convention, what CEDAW does is it looks at how we apply those broad three international documents to the lives of women and girls. So that's the UDHR, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the ICCPR, the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, and ISCA, the International Convention on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. So those three are the big documents that set out human rights. And then these other treaties are the ones that tell us how to apply those to make them make sense in the lives of women and girls. And there are three big principles that sit underneath CEDAW. The first one is non-discrimination. So you need to eliminate discrimination on the basis of gender or sex in order to be able to allow women to fulfill their human rights. The second one is substantive equality. So CEDAW is based on the idea, not that we treat everybody exactly the same, but that we treat everybody in a way that allows them to equally realise their rights. And then the third principle is that the treaty is about state obligations. It's about what states need to do. So it's not about what you need to do, and it's not about what the people around you need to do. It's about what governments need to do, and it's about what your country needs to do. The treaty itself has 4 parts. So the first part is Articles 1 to 5 of the treaty, and that just sets out the sort of general framework. The next part is the one that most people pay attention to. It's Articles 6 to 16, and they're the ones that tell you about actual application of CEDAW to human rights. And we'll have a look at those in a moment. And then Articles 7 to 23 set out the committee's rules and procedures. So this is the committee that looks after CEDAW. And then Articles 23 to 30 set out the rules for administration and interpretation of the convention. And so the obligations of the states under CEDAW are quite broad. So they require states to take action in both public and private spheres. So it's not just about what happens in public, what happens at home matters too. It requires states to take action in all areas of women's lives. So it specifies a few specific areas in the treaty, but actually requires action across the entire life cycle and for all women, regardless of what sort of intersectional discrimination they might be facing. It also requires states to take action for all women. So as I say, it needs to be for all women, even people who are marginalised either by their gender or by other factors such as race or age. Here's a quick look at the sort of things that are covered by the Articles 6 to 16. So CEDAW starts by talking about the non-discrimination principle, and then says that states need to take policy measures to address the rights of women and girls. And it guarantees the basic human rights and fundamental freedoms of all women and girls. And then it makes provision for special measures, things that states are allowed to do, which might discriminate against people, but it's okay because you're trying to deal with an existing discrimination. So you're trying to remove a barrier to someone by creating a special case. You're allowed to keep those in place as long as that barrier still exists. And then there are a whole range of other areas listed where special attention and specific recommendations about what needs to happen to fulfill women's human rights are set out in more detail. You can have a look at the treaty itself when we've finished the presentation today. But for the moment, it's worth knowing that these areas tend to be drafted in very broad terms and tend to reflect the fact that they were drafted back in the late 70s and early 80s. So some of them are phrased in a way that we might not be comfortable with now, and some of them actually feel like there are issues missing. So for example, if you look at that list, there's nothing about violence. We've got trafficking and exploitation, but nothing about violence against women. And we'll come back to that in a moment. So let's go back to the UN system. You can break the UN system down into 3 kind of big clumpy sections when it comes to human rights. The first part is the political bodies, and this is way over on the right side. And this is things like the General Assembly, like we were talking about earlier, and the Human Rights Council. And those bodies are states coming together to make decisions about human rights and to make clear statements about what they intend to do about human rights. And so, for instance, you get things like in the General Assembly, they've passed a resolution known as ARES 76-300. You don't have to worry about the number, which is on the human right to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment. And that's very recent. That was just last year. So all the states of the world came together and passed a motion which says, actually, there is a human right. Now that's non-binding because it doesn't appear in a treaty. That means states don't have to do it. But the fact that the General Assembly, the states there have said, we think this is important, starts to create a sort of peer pressure, which will build the idea of the right. And eventually it will probably end up in a treaty somewhere. The other political body that sits over that side is the Security Council, and they sometimes make resolutions about human rights as well. The one that people are most familiar with is Resolution 1325 on the Women, Peace and Security agenda. And then the Human Rights Council plays an important role in teasing out some of the fine detail of both the human rights treaties and also the resolutions that come out of the General Assembly and the Security Council. And they'll do that through resolutions and through debates in council meetings. Way over on the left-hand side of this diagram, we've got the United Nations organisations, and there's a list of logos there showing a number of the different organisations that are specifically involved in human rights work. And those organisations are basically bodies set up under the UN which do the technical work and the research work of working out exactly what human rights violations look like on the ground, what are the barriers that women face, and what is some of the data that we need to be able to properly identify what needs to be done. So, for example, UN Women will run research projects and prepare reports which discuss issues like violence against women or economic security for women. And so they will provide the information that states can use to implement solutions. They also run programs which help to implement some of those solutions on the ground in various different countries. And for those of you who have done work at CSW, the Commission on the Status of Women, CSW, is an odd mix of the United Nations organisations on the left-hand side of the diagram and the political bodies on the right-hand side of the diagram. It is a meeting of the states of the UN, which is organised through what's called ESCAP, which is the Economic Security Commission of the UN, and through UN Women. And so it's got both the states coming together and United Nations organisations involved. And then in the middle of this diagram, we have a list of the treaty bodies which exist under the UN. And the one that concerns us today is the fourth one down, which is the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. And this committee is set up under the treaty, and it's the body that looks after the treaty and tries to encourage states to be able to make progress in implementing the treaty. So let's look at that committee. The CEDAW Committee is made up of 23 independent experts who are elected from across the world, and they sit in Geneva. It's worth noting Australia has an independent expert on the CEDAW Committee at the moment. That's Natasha Stott-Despoja, who is currently up for re-election. So we'll see whether she gets elected. Fingers crossed she does, she's very good. But those independent experts are tasked with following what states are doing about implementing the CEDAW Convention, and also with doing the work needed to articulate what we mean when we talk about those rights. Because even in CEDAW, there are lots of grey areas and lots of detail we need to tease out. So the CEDAW Committee monitors implementation of CEDAW. And one of the big things it does to do that is it asks all states to produce a report on how they're going under CEDAW every 4 years. They can also receive complaints under the optional protocol to CEDAW. Now, the optional protocol, as I said earlier, is an add-on to the CEDAW Convention. States sign on to or ratify the CEDAW Convention, and then they can also sign on to or ratify the optional protocol. And the optional protocol lets lets individuals make a complaint about states. And we've actually had one of those. Those of you who know Therese Edwards at the National Council of Single Mothers will know that she was involved in running a complaint in relation to the Parents Next program in Australia. The other thing that the committee can do is they can initiate their own inquiries. So if they can see something is wrong, they can start their own inquiry under the optional protocol. And the final thing they do, which is really important, is they formulate the general recommendations. Let's have a look at some of those general recommendations. Here's a couple of them from the last few years. So General Recommendation, GR 38, Trafficking in Women and Girls in the Context of Global Migration. That one comes from 2020. GR 37 is Gender-Related Dimensions of Disaster Risk Reduction in the Context of Climate Change from 2018. GR 35 is Gender-Based Violence Against Women, updating the general recommendation that they had way back at number 19 in 2017. And General Resolution 26 is on women migrant workers, and that's from 2009. So you can see that these resolutions are all very specific in their coverage. They cover different issues or they cover different populations of women and girls. But what they do is provide much more detailed information about how to realise the rights of women and girls for those groups or in those situations. I particularly want to highlight General Resolution 35, which is the one on gender-based violence against women, because that one and General Resolution 19 are the ones that did the work of saying, actually, there's a major barrier to women's human rights that we haven't addressed here in the CEDAW Treaty. But if you look at the CEDAW Treaty, it's obvious from every line of it that if we don't deal with violence, we can't implement the rest of the treaty. And so the general resolutions are a tool by which the committee can say, here's a barrier that might not have made it into the text of CEDAW, but which is nevertheless really critically important. The fact that violence isn't in the CEDAW Convention has led to a campaign to have a separate standalone treaty on the elimination of violence against women and girls. That campaign is still underway. We'll have to wait to see whether it bears fruit or gets up. So one example of a general resolution, which is an interesting one, is the General Resolution 39 on Indigenous women and girls from 2022. The reason this one's particularly interesting is because the document that sits mostly under this resolution is not CEDAW at all. It's the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or UNDRIP. And so what's interesting about that is that the committee has said this resolution has been passed. It's an important one, and it's going to have an impact on CEDAW. And so we need to bring the two together. So what GR 39 does is it sets out some of the barriers that women face that are linked to other issues. So the intersectional barriers, such as racism, racial discrimination, colonialism, sex and gender-based discrimination, and access to land and territories. It also identifies forms of violence that are specific to Indigenous women. So examples might be harms to the collective identity and cultural life of women and girls, or environmental violence, including climate-related harm that states haven't addressed, and also political violence suffered by women who seek to participate in public spaces. This is just some of the things that General Resolution 39 on Indigenous women and girls does, but it shows you that these general resolutions can provide a lot more detail about what implementing women's human rights needs, and they can also do the really important job of evolving our understanding of human rights. And that's an important thing to keep in mind, that some of these documents that were written many years ago don't necessarily line up with our current understanding of the lives of women and girls and all people who are marginalised by gender. And so that means that sometimes we need to interpret or provide more detail on CEDAW that allows the rights to grow as our understanding grows. So let's look at CEDAW in Australia. So we were an early adopter when it came to the CEDAW Treaty. We ratified in 1983. It came into force in 1981. And we made 2 reservations at the time. So reservations are where a state says, we agree with this treaty, except for these bits. And those 2 reservations were in relation to maternity pay, or parental pay, we would call it now, and combat-related duties. We still have 1 reservation in relation to combat-related duties. We also ratified the optional protocol. That's the one that lets people make individual complaints back in 2009. And almost immediately after ratifying CEDAW, the federal government passed the Sex Discrimination Act, which was intended to be the first step in implementing the CEDAW Treaty. And if we go back to our description of the CEDAW Treaty at the beginning, you'll remember it's got 3 parts. And the first part was the principle of non-discrimination. And the Sex Discrimination Act is intended to deal with that part of CEDAW. But you have to remember there are also 2 other parts. One is substantive equality, and the other part is states' obligations. And we're not so good on those 2. So while we do have lots of policy in Australia for gender equality and for removing the barriers to women's human rights, we don't have a Charter of Human Rights in Australia at federal level. Some states and territories have them, but our federal government doesn't have one yet. And that means that implementing human rights in Australia has a couple of big holes in it. It's quite difficult for us to be able to talk about the obligations that Australia has towards women and girls when we don't have a Charter of Human Rights which would set that out. It's worth keeping an eye on that because it's about to become a live issue. So the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights has been running an inquiry into Australia's human rights framework. That inquiry has just been extended, so it's due to report back in May this year. And that report will be about whether or not our existing framework is adequate. And in my humble opinion, without a Charter of Rights, it certainly isn't. The other thing to keep an eye on is that the Australian Law Reform Commission tabled a report to the government on the 21st of March this year, which looks at religious discrimination in schools. And it recommended that no school should be permitted to discriminate against students or staff based on attributes protected by that Sex Discrimination Act. And so we're probably looking at a little bit of movement around what human rights looks like in Australia over the next year or so. So keep an eye out for that. So the process we're in now, making a report under the CEDAW Convention. So this is what the CEDAW Committee asks Australia to do. It's part of the treaty, so Australia signed up to do it. We're supposed to make a report every 4 years. There's also a mechanism by which other states could make complaints about Australia if they wanted to. And then there's also the optional protocol, which we've mentioned. So it's possible for individuals to make complaints about individuals or about states. And it's possible for the committee to inquire into issues. So let's look at that review process, because that's the one that we're in right now. I'd just like to take a short detour to have a look at Australia's CEDAW reporting history. Because if you go back to our first report, which was submitted 4 years after we implemented, actually, apologies, 2 years after we implemented, since then, we've been very, very slow in our reporting. The next report was 6 years away. The one after that was 3 years, so that was a good one. And then it was 8 years before the next report, and then 5 years before the next one, and then 7 years. And then we haven't put our 9th periodic report in yet. And so far it's been 7 years since the last one. So we're well behind in our reporting. And it means that when we help in this reporting process, we're not just covering 4 years, we're covering 7 years. And so it's worth keeping that in mind. So if you're thinking about what information to contribute to this report process, you need to be thinking back to 2016 and what's changed since then. So when CEDAW reporting happens, we have the report by Australia, which is called the State Report, and that report is made to the CEDAW Committee. Then we have the National Human Rights Institution Shadow Report. That's our National Human Rights Institution is the Australian Human Rights Commission. And so the Australian Human Rights Commission will prepare their own shadow report. And a shadow report is one that kind of gives the other perspective. So the state will say, this is what we've done. And yes, we've still got some problems we need to sort out. The shadow reports say, actually, this is what they haven't done. And here are some good things they did. So the emphasis is quite different, but it's like getting the opposition view, or perhaps a view from the grassroots rather than from Capitol Hill in Canberra. There are other kinds of shadow reports. International NGOs make shadow reports. And the one that interests us is that domestic NGO alliances can make shadow reports. Individual NGOs can also make reports, and it's worth keeping this in mind because if you're with an organisation that would like to make a very specialised report on an area that you're expert in, you can do that, and we'll talk about how in a minute. However, right now, we are working on a shadow report for the National Women's Alliances, which has been funded by the Office for Women. And so it's going to be one of those domestic NGO alliance shadow reports. So this reporting process for an alliance shadow report, we get 6,600 words, and that's it. So it's not very many when you consider that the list of issues that the committee has asked us to address has 26 separate areas, each one of which has multiple sub areas. So we're probably only looking at being able to say 300 words for every issue we want to cover. So we need to be very high level and we need to be very concise. If you're doing an individual shadow report, so you're not part of an alliance for the shadow report, you only get 3,300 words. And yep, that includes footnotes. In the materials that we sent out along with the link to this meeting, you'll find a document which is by the International Women's Rights Action Watch Asia Pacific, or IRAW, which is a guide to preparing shadow reports. You might find that useful. It's very specifically aimed at women's rights in work and in informal work as well. But it's a useful example of how you might then apply those techniques to your own area of expertise. So I highly recommend having a look at that report. The shadow reporting process can take two forms. Normally what happens when you're preparing a shadow report is that you go through and you address each one of those 6 to 16 articles that we saw earlier on. So articles 6 to 16, you normally go through and say what the government has or hasn't done under each of those articles. This time around, the Australian government has opted for what is called the simplified procedure. And I say it's called the simplified procedure because it doesn't feel a lot simpler. The CEDAW Committee, instead of waiting to hear from Australia about each of the articles, has put together a list of issues. And that list is based largely on the previous recommendations that it's made in previous review processes and on some new information, which has come from NGOs or simply from general information that's available. For example, there is an area about COVID, which hasn't appeared previously. This list is just for government. It's not actually for us, but it is a useful guide to what the committee's focus will be. So we are going to be structuring our shadow report around the list, but the final paragraph in the list is a request for any other issues. And so if your issue doesn't appear in that list, don't feel like you can't speak. You are still very welcome to submit information to us. We would like to be able to add some space for issues that are new, that are coming up that we haven't seen before. A couple of the issues that are coming up that we might need to raise because they're not in the list of issues are things like the effect of AI or technology on the lives of women, or the way technology is being used to harass women in public life. So some of those issues are the sorts of things that you might want to raise under anything else. The list of issues that we've been given, as I said, is extensive. There are 26 separate areas and they cover all sorts of things. I won't read out all of them, but they cover a mix of things that we've previously had recommendations to Australia on, and the committee would like to know where we are on that. So things like women, peace and security, education, stereotypes and harmful practices. But there are also a couple of things that are new that have come up, and in particular, women's rights in relation to the COVID pandemic and in relation to other global crises. There's also some references to climate change, which haven't previously appeared in that form. And so it's a mix of old things and new things, but mostly things that Australia's been asked to do before. And so one important thing to keep in mind is whether you think that a particular issue is something that the Australian government knows it needs to do, but has been ignoring. When you look at that list, and that list is attached to the email that we sent out with the link to join this meeting, you'll see that each of those headings has sub-paragraphs under it, which get really detailed. Don't worry if your area doesn't fit into that detail again. It falls into that last one you can see on that slide, which is additional information. So even if you look at that list and think it's not talking about the issue I want to talk about, you can still tell us. The other thing, however, is it's really useful for us to be able to get a grassroots or an individual perspective on whether the things that Australia is doing are working. So sometimes the Australian government will say, we've already done lots about education, particularly women in STEM, science, technology, I forgot what the year is, education and maths. And so yeah, the government will say, we're doing great things, but it might be that you know that that policy isn't working or that they're not doing something really important that they should be doing. So that sort of information is really valuable for the CEDAW committee to get. So if you can add information like that, that's really helpful. This is a diagram of the CEDAW review cycle. So when the committee considers Australia and Australia's progress under the CEDAW Convention, this is the cycle they follow. So we can start over on the left-hand side. Actually, let's start with the concluding observations. Over on the right-hand side, it's the purple circle that says concluding observations. We start there. That's the last list of recommendations that the committee made. And for us, that was back in 2018. Those concluding observations then should be the subject of domestic lobbying. And we'll talk about that a little bit in a moment. After a 4-year period, we move on to the yellow circle, which says follow-up report. And so the next step in our cycle is that Australia makes its report. And at that point, a follow-up report, I'm just going to move forward to a slide that helps us with that, is where the CEDAW Committee says, on these particular recommendations, we want you to come back to us early. And so they come back 1 or 2 years later, and Australia will make a report then, and then there'll be shadow reports. And so that's an opportunity, if your issue is one of the ones the committee is really concerned by, to get involved quite quickly. The next thing after the follow-up process is that we move around to the government's report at the end of their next 4-year period. So we start with the government report. We put in our arrow on the left, the NGO shadow reports. They all go into the cycle. And then the committee will send some written questions to Australia. And Australia will provide some written answers. And at that point, there's an opportunity for NGOs to talk to the committee about those answers and about the report and about how things are going generally. And I'll just move quickly on to the slide about that. So during the review process, after those written answers, the committee will hold some what they call informal public meetings. They're not very informal, but they call them informal because they're not part of the main process of the committee. And NGOs can turn up to that and have 1 10-minute oral intervention per country, which means 1 10 minutes of speaking for Australia, which means we've all got to share it. Then there's a series of private lunchtime briefings with the committee, and that's country specific. So if you can get into that, you can talk more specifically and answer questions that might have come up in the informal public meeting. Then you can also use fact sheets, both at those private lunchtime briefings and the informal public meeting, to help to provide a little bit more detail because your time is limited when you talk to the committee. And it's a good idea if you're doing this to make sure that you're working with international NGOs as well as with NGOs here in Australia so that you can all coordinate together so you don't waste any of that very precious time. The next thing that happens in the cycle is they have something called the constructive dialogue, which is really a verbal report. Australia turns up to Geneva and a lot of NGOs turn up too. They have those informal meetings and those lunch meetings, and then Australia sits in front of the committee and answers questions. As a result of that hearing, we then get a new set of concluding observations. And so that's the process for the review, moving all the way around the 4-year cycle. So to finish up, before we talk about how you can get involved in this process, it's important to understand why you'd get involved in this process. So CEDAW feels like it's a long way away, and progress under CEDAW feels really slow because, as I was saying earlier, human rights are actually something that we dreamed up, sort of within living memory, and we are still building them and evolving them, and we're still bringing everybody along on the journey. So what happens at CEDAW tends to be a bit baseline. It tends to be a little bit below our expectations as people who really want to help the people in our communities and really remove barriers. However, it's really important to be involved in the CEDAW processes and in all the human rights processes, because when we get those concluding observations, they're an external peer pressure mechanism for us to be able to say to government, it's not just us saying this, it's the world. You need to be making these changes even if they're hard, even if they cost money, you need to be finding ways to make this work. And the way to do that is to map the concluding observations against the work that you do. So work out which of the concluding observations are the ones that matter most to your work. Work out what the committee said that Australia should be doing, and then lobby for that to happen. When you make a submission to government or write a report or have meetings with parliamentarians or departments, it's always a good idea to say, this is, of course, a recommendation under the concluding observations, and have a copy of that recommendation with you when you have that meeting, or to pop it into your submission, maybe in an annex. It's also really important to be talking to stakeholders, so your clients, the people you work with, the people in your community, about the fact that they have these rights, so that people become generally more human rights literate and are better able to make decisions about, for example, who you vote for based on what their human rights needs are. So the sorts of things that you might find in concluding observations, if you're looking through them to see how they relate to your work, you'll see a bit where the committee says, these are the positive things that Australia's done. You'll see a bit where they raise areas of concern, and sometimes they're raising areas of concern in quite strong terms, and then they'll make recommendations in relation to each of those areas of concern. And so those recommendations are the ones that you want to be looking at when compared to your work. It's also a good idea to look at the treaty itself and to work out whether there are any of the articles in that treaty that relate specifically to your work, or also to go to the general recommendations of the CEDAW Committee and find whether there's a general recommendation that relates to your area of work. So, for instance, if you were working on the rights of sex workers in Australia, you'd be looking at the trafficking general recommendation for more information about how CEDAW should apply in your area of work. We've looked at the follow-up process. The last thing I wanted to raise is that there are other ways other than talking to government about how to implement CEDAW, other ways to implement CEDAW. One of those, which is a really good example I encourage you to look up, is an initiative in the US called Cities for CEDAW. So the thing about the CEDAW Convention is that it applies to all levels of government, even though it's the federal government who goes and does the reporting. So when the federal government prepares its report, it actually talks to state governments and in some cases to local governments as well, and asks them for information about what's being done to implement CEDAW. And that all goes into their report. That process in the US has led to a number of local governments deciding to sort of cut out the middle person and start doing their own implementation of CEDAW. And if you're running a program, one of the things you can do is map how your program operates against the CEDAW obligations and see whether your work is CEDAW compliant. Because while CEDAW applies specifically to the obligations of states, it sets out a sort of roadmap of what the barriers are and the ways in which we should be removing those barriers that can be relevant to everyone's work. The map there is a map of the current cities for CEDAW across the US, and you can see it's quite a big movement of local governments who are all actively doing that work of mapping against the recommendations and working out what they need to be doing in their local communities with CEDAW. I'm going to wrap it up there. Are there any last questions? No. Okay, well, in that case, I'm going to hand over to Maddie to talk a little bit about what our next steps are. Over to you, Maddie.
Hey everyone, good afternoon. I'm aware we only have a couple of minutes, so I'll try and keep it very short. As Colin has already talked about, we will be running some consultation sessions by getting a little bit of feedback. Myself and then Roy. Okay, can you hear me now again? Okay, brilliant. Thank you for bearing with us, everyone. As Helen has already flagged, we're going to be running some consultation sessions for anyone who wants to contribute to the formulation of that shadow report. So there'll be 2 consultation sessions. One will be this week on the 18th of April from 12 p.m. to 2 p.m. That's just a general session for anyone who's interested. And then there will be a secondary consultation workshop on the 23rd of April from 12 p.m. to 2 p.m. for young women specifically. And when we say young women, we mean people up to 30 years of age. So please come to whichever one of those feels more appropriate to you. We also have the 2 surveys that we've already talked a little bit about that you have access to via both the Jamboard and the email. So feel free to either fill out the simple version of that one, where you can just go through and tick the sections that apply to you, the issues you want to talk about, or the more detailed survey where you can send us a little bit of information on any of those issues ahead of time. We've just run out of time, so I'll leave it there. If you did have a question that you wanted to ask and didn't get a chance to, please just email that through to us. And I'll just thank again our interpreters and our captioners for their service today. Thank you, everyone, and hopefully we will see you all on the 18th. All right, have a great day, everyone.